Hi, welcome back once again to the new House New York with Brooklyn real estate attorney Robert Howe. I'm Jason Versace, his co-host and producer, and we're going to be kicking off a new series of legal topics. Our first one we're going to be starting off with is what happens if you die without a will in New York? Now, as always, once again, here's our host, Robert Howe.
Good to be back with you, Jason. Thanks for doing this. And I think it makes you think a little about these topics, makes me think a little about these topics. Although, to be honest, I've been thinking about them for 45 years. But it does help to put our thoughts together and make something simple and coherent for our clients and watchers to understand.
So we've probably talked about these topics and these questions a number of times over the years, and I don't know if things have changed. I know things can change all the time. New regulations go away. Some old regulations may come back. But let's just start off with this and ask, what is actually does it mean to die interstate in New York?
So fortunately, when I was in high school, one of the classes that I took was Latin. And intestate means no will. Very simple. All right. Of course, lawyers can't say it that simply because then you wouldn't need lawyers.
We just need Latin professors.
Yes, we have a few Latin terms that unless you went to some sort of parochial high school, you may not have been offered Latin as a class. But needless to say, I think Latin, I tell people Latin and typing were two of the most important classes I ever took. In any event, so intestate means without a will. So there are several things that could happen when you pass away. One is that you don't do anything. You just leave it to chance. And you don't see a lawyer, you don't put other people's names on your bank accounts, things of that nature, and you just kick off and hopefully on a good note. But you leave behind family and friends who then have to deal with your estate, and your estate could be, paying bills, closing out a variety of things, lawsuits, whatever. But it also could be collecting assets and giving that, to the people who deserve, to inherit that stuff. So fortunately, there is a misconception out there that if you don't have a will, everything goes to New York State. We're in New York State right now. And I guess in other states, people also probably share that same idea that it goes to their own state. Now, while that is something that the legislators would love to have happen, and who knows, maybe one day they will have that happen, but right now that's not happening. What is happening is that there have been a set of rules that say when a person passes away and they're survived by either parents, a spouse, siblings, children, nieces and nephews, and maternal and paternal cousins, depending on who's above who, that rung would inherit your property. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. It doesn't go to the state, but once again, you know that when the government makes a rule to make your life better, sometimes it doesn't necessarily make it better. And some of the unintended consequences could be that people inherit stuff and they say, I hardly knew my cousin. Tell me more about them. And the people who may have been friends with that person during their lifetime and cared for them, took them shopping, took them to the supermarket, took them to doctors, they get zero. And the blood
Mm.
relatives who had no involvement with them whatsoever get something. And I guess they had that movie where, people find out that Uncle Joe passed away in Europe and had zillions of dollars and, people who he never met, never knew inherited. I actually have a case that I had people in Brooklyn who passed away, no relatives in the United States, but relatives in Ireland. And the relatives in Ireland inherited everything. The nice part of that story is they were lovely, humble people who inherited the money, and each one had a story that they needed it for some reason, lost a job, lost a spouse, became ill. But they were all very humble people that got it. So that was a nice ending to that story there. The laws of intestacy worked, for a good result. But you may not want to give your property to people you've never or seldom seen. So good news is it doesn't go to New York State. Bad thing is the government made the rules and regulations, and sometimes it'll go to people that you never even.
It's like the old Ronald Reagan line, I'm from the government, and I'm here to help, the worst 9 words. So that answers our question of who inherits your assets if there's no will. But
Right.
what about
There is a pecking order, and you can look at it online, and it delineates very clearly if you have this person alive, that person inherits, that person's not around, then these people inherit, and if those people are not around, then those people get it.
So does the process differ for someone who's married versus someone who's single?
Well, in the intestacy state, not much, but there is one instance. If you are married with children and do not have a will, your spouse would inherit about half of your estate, and your children would inherit the other half of the estate. Now, that doesn't sound so bad. The problem is the parent who's alive now becomes partners with the children who could be minors. And the children have half the money and they don't have to pay the bills. They don't have to buy food, they pay rent, mortgage, etc. So all of a sudden your spouse becomes a partner with their children, and that's a consequence that is by law, but many times is not the type of consequence that you want when your spouse passes away.
So are there any problems that families are going to run into when there's no will? Are there well, anything can come up? I'm sure nothing can possibly arise if there's no legal documentation. Let's move to the next one.
Well, we people can fight over anything. Lawyers can fight over anything. People can make a big deal. Lawyers can make a bigger deal. So, the issues that I see when somebody dies, there's a moment of sadness. Everybody's crying in the funeral home. Oh, I love that woman. I love that man. They were so good. And inevitably, shortly thereafter, maybe not right in the funeral, they will say, "Where is the property gonna go?" So I told you they have a pecking order already. So they know that the spouse probably gets it, the kids probably get it. But, many times people die with unknown relatives that they feel that they are the last ones on the face of the earth. They probably are not, but they just not been in touch with anybody. So there's an issue of who's going to run the show. And once again, there are laws that say who would be entitled to run the show. They're called administrators. Administration is when you don't have a will and you would ask the court to say, hey, I am the son. I think I'd like to be the head of this estate. I'd like to be named the administrator. The problem, of course, is there could be 3 children, and all of them may want to be the person driving the bus, not the person who's on the bus. And those people may have significant others who are in their ear and say things like, oh, it shouldn't be going that way. You should be the boss or whatever. So occasionally you have a handful of people wanting to be the boss, the administrator, and you could have a situation where they do agree, okay, so maybe me and my brother will be co-administrators. All right. Many times that works. Many times they're put together because they were arguing and they couldn't agree to who would be the boss. So the idea of putting them together when they didn't agree in the first place is probably not the best idea. If the people really can't agree, there is an office called the Office of the Public Administrator. And one of the roles of the public administrator is to administer estates that are not otherwise being administered. Now, this usually comes into play when a person dies and there are no relatives whatsoever that can be located at the moment. So the public administrator will step in to sort of run whatever real estate or manage whatever real estate, ultimately sell it, and then find relatives. And these could be cousins that they've never seen before. Many times you have to go outside the United States and find, relatives to give this property to. And as we talked about, they're very surprised. I didn't know my cousin in America had this, but I'm glad, you know, not that he passed away, but that I'm inheriting some money. And the problem with the public administrator, once again, it's a government agency, but they're a government agency and they're going to do what legally they can do. And it's not going to be the warm, fuzzy feeling of, Uncle Joe, being the administrator and making sure that nobody's feathers are ruffled. So that's usually one of the big order issues in intestacy when you have an administration. A handful of people can all raise their hand and say, I want to be the boss. I run the show.
So basically, like in any legal situation where a family is involved, there's going to be a basic setup of hierarchy of if there's a legal document that's already put in place, it's going to lay out the rules and the groundwork and give you a framework. If there's not, somebody's going to have to step in and be the administrator. And then let's just say that they can't find any family. Like, is there a time limit for this to run out before they've exhausted all means, and if they can't locate any relatives to disperse assets to? then what happens?
Well, so before that happens, what happens there are businesses and law offices and companies that find heirs. They make it their business that when they see paperwork being filed in the court where it says John Smith, relatives unknown, they jump on those kind of cases. And through genealogy research, they do find people. I've never experienced where they never found people,
So
but if they never found people, I guess the money would be held, by the state, forever. And I don't think it ever goes to the state or owned by the state, but it'll be held by the estate.
good.
And
That's good.
these airship people then will reach out to these people and say, I can't tell you who it is, but you may be entitled to some money. And if you want to
Mm.
retain my firm, I'll help you prove that you're one of the people who should inherit. And those fees could run 20 to 30% of what, you collect. And some people, of course, say, "Oh, that's too much money." But when you're getting zero,
Mm.
it's either a choice between zero or
Yeah.
some money. You should spend some money because these people know how to present you to the court to say that, "Hey, I'm actually a blood relative." The grandparents go all the way down, maternal and paternal, down to the cousin range, and they would be able to prove by documents and testimony that, hey, this is a maternal or a paternal cousin. So they're called kinship hearings, and it's pretty interesting, full blown hearing where
Hmm.
people who represent the potential heirs are bringing forth both documentary evidence, birth certificates, death certificates, all sorts of whatever the genealogy world has to put together to show that your family came over and this person married that person and the whole thing went off. So it is a pretty fascinating area of law.
It's interesting to hear all these things because people probably sometimes just think of these topics and think, "I will," and I just need to write this out on a napkin. And but the fact that it's so intricate and so specific, and everything is spelled out so thoroughly, is very interesting. So
And before you get off this napkin thing, there
yeah.
is I remember 45 years or so years ago about a discussion with the professor saying that people theoretically could make a will on a napkin, cocktail napkin, when they're in a bar. And there is a country western song, I forget the name of it at the moment, but two men are sitting together, younger man, older man, and they get into a conversation. Later on in life, they find out that the older man passed away. He was a millionaire and didn't leave anything to his relatives, but left it to the guy at the bar that he was having a nice conversation about life too. So there are not often, but
Check napkin before you throw out napkins. Just
uh,
flip them over and see if there's any
yes,
any documents on it.
yes, absolutely.
So, all right. So we'll kind of tie this all together now. And what's steps that people could take to right now today if they're entering into this process and they're thinking ahead and they're being responsible to avoid putting their family through any of these issues that might arise. Is there something they could do to make sure that that doesn't happen in that eventuality?
Going back to this, planning is better than not planning, and they should, talk among their friends who may have done some estate planning, they call it. Estate planning could be very in depth, or it could be very simple, a simple will, something like that, and see if they could recommend an attorney in their area who does work with wills and estates, and even have a low cost or no cost consultation with an attorney to see what their options are. The options, as I told you, is do nothing or do a will, or as we'll talk about in another topic, do a trust. And then they will get comfortable with how they want to proceed. Some clients consult with me, never come back, and then their relatives call you, so and so passed away. Do you have their will? I know he or she went to see you, and I'll look in the file and say, yes, I was consulted, but they never came back. They were not able to pull the trigger. So making your future plans is really not the most fun thing you're going to do in life. You're talking about when you're not around. And many of us feel like, I really don't care what happens when I'm not around.
Fight amongst yourselves.
Yes, and some of my clients tell me that they say, "Let the kids figure it out." Not all of them have. Some are planners, and they say, "No, I want to figure it out. I don't want my kids to have to figure it out." But they should consult with friends as to who they have used for estate planning. Maybe go on the internet for local, referrals and see what sort of comments people get. And it was funny. I'm on Facebook occasionally, and this morning I happened to be, and someone posed the question, who would you use for, estate planning? And there were a handful of people, and I was one of them. So I was happy about that. So there were all those resources.
Well, and you hear all the time. I mean, I don't know if this is maybe if this would be the number one answer on the board, but when you hear parents refer to assets like a beach house or a car or an antique car or anything like that, they'll say, "I don't want you kids to fight over it." So is that really the number one reason for parents putting a will together for thinking about when they're not around?
Yeah, not fighting about it is good, and, the majority of the times, parents err on the side of equal. Occasionally, if one child, could be super, have a lot of funds and a great job and a lot of money, they may say, "Look, he doesn't need it, but the one who's unemployed right now really needs it." So, there could be a little inequality, or the person who doesn't, if, there are 4 children, 3 of them have houses, 1 doesn't have a house, they may give their house to the one child that doesn't. Because one lesson I've learned in life is that even if you have gobs of stuff, you still, if there's inequality and he gets more, she gets less, there's always that little rub that why did I get less? Just because I have a lot of money, my life experience is that having a lot of money does not prohibit you from wanting more money. And they may feel, why did they get the house and I only got, 25%. But there's always that human nature. There's a lot of psychology that goes on when I talk to people about planning. And then I see the other side of the psychology when the family comes back and they say so and so passed away, and we're discussing the plan that they made. And occasionally you can see that there's a little bit of like, hey, why did he get more? Why did she get less? But that's human nature.
Well, I think that answers a lot of these questions that we've had tied into the topic of what happens if you die in New York without a will. And it is an interesting topic. It's a topic, of course, no one likes to think about. I'm sure no one does think about it much, but again, a necessary question to answer and then just forget about it, not think about it. So
And
with that,
parting advice to all my clients who say, "Do you need a will?" I say, "You need a will yesterday." And that's the thought that I leave them with. And most of them do some planning after I pose it that way.
well, it's all good advice and good information and stuff that people should take to heart. So we're gonna wrap up our first episode back on the New House New York. As always, we are joined by our expert, Robert Howe. Bob, why don't you take us out of our first episode?
I'll leave you with the thought that I told you about. You all need a will, yourself included, Jason, yesterday. And don't leave it to, chance that the government has taken care of you. They do to a certain extent, but probably not the way you would have liked them to.
Words of wisdom. Okay, everybody, we'll be back soon with another episode of How's New York. Stay well.